This morning, we are coming now to what we're calling broadly colonial Christianity. You know that we've been dealing with the Reformation. The last 4 weeks, we've been looking really at the 4 major nations that were impacted by the Protestant Reformation. These are concurrent histories. So they're not sequential, but all of these are more or less happening simultaneously. The Reformation in Germany, of course, gets the ball rolling, but then we think of the Swiss Reformation with Calvin, the Scottish Reformation with John Knox, and last week, of course, we did a rapid-fire survey of the English Reformation, beginning with Henry VIII and concluding more or less with Oliver Cromwell and some of the events related to the interregnum there. And of course, it was in that final chapter of the Puritan phenomenon in England, and really what's sometimes called the Puritan Revolution in England, that many people actually left England and departed for the New World in the hopes of, in a more credible and systematic manner with some greater integrity, to implement what they believed to be the great gains of the Reformation on fresh soil, kind of doing it from scratch, as it were. And so the hope was to establish a new England and to do it more or less along the lines of the Reformation. And so it's that story that we want to look at this morning in the limited time that we have. And so let's turn our attention to that, but first of all, let's ask God's blessing on our time together. Father, we ask that you would be present here among us this morning. We pray that our review of these events of history, which come much closer to home now for us as Americans, and as we think of our own American history and how formative was the presence of your people during the early years of life on this continent, that our reflection on these matters would be guided by your Spirit into a deeper and better understanding of those matters which form our faith and cause us to see Christ more clearly. We offer these prayers in the name of Jesus, our King and Lord. Amen. Well, you know from your high school American history that England was kind of a Johnny-come-lately in the colonial efforts. That before England really did much at all in the way of a colonizing effort, France and Spain had both more or less established pretty respectable beachheads in the New World, really south of where England wound up doing its work, but nevertheless, some century or so earlier, we already had the presence of the French and the Spanish here. During Elizabeth's reign that we kind of reviewed briefly last week, you may recall that we saw, some of what was happening in the religious life in England at that time. Really very little in terms of a colonizing effort. The Puritan movement generally was attempting under her reign to implement within England and within the Church of England what they viewed as a proper approach to the life of the church, hoping to change it more or less from within. Hence the name Puritan, hopefully purifying the church. Francis Drake certainly had some interest in the colonial effort. We remember him mostly as a kind of gentlemanly English pirate, who made a little bit of havoc for the French and the Spanish respectively, and certainly the defeat of the Armada in 1588 was an important high point in his career. He did do a little bit of travel in the New World up and down the coast, and certainly postulated at times that this might be a venture that England would want to take a look at, but nothing really happened under him. And really it wasn't until we come to James I, who you recall came to the throne in 1603, that the first impulse toward a colonizing effort occurs. James I, of course, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. We looked again briefly at his life and his work last week. Under his reign, about 4 years after he became king, there was some finally effort or interest in establishing a legitimate colony in the New World. And so there was established at that time what was called the London Company. This was in 1607. These people were all working very much within the spiritual confines of the Church of England. This was not the Puritan movement whatsoever, but there was some interest in, under James, establishing some kind of beachhead in the New World and hopefully gaining his support and, more importantly, his investment in doing so. And so in 1607, that in fact did take place. The venture occurred under the London Company. and they set sail in 1607, arrived in the New World, and established a city, or at least a community there, named in honor of King James, hence it was called Jamestown. However, the larger colony was named in celebration of the Virgin Queen who had immediately preceded James, and hence the name celebrating Elizabeth, the so-called Virgin Queen, was named Virginia. And so that was the first colonial presence here in the New World at the instance of the English. There were strong religious sentiments within the Virginia colony and Jamestown, but all of it was very much within conventional Anglican liturgy and practice. This was not really a Puritan effort at all, but it was the first English effort at establishing a colonial presence. If you read the writings of those who were involved there, you certainly see that there was a strong Christian impulse that was going through what they did, but not so much sympathetic to the Reformation as such. This, of course, was where Captain John Smith was famous. So he was the governor of this region for some period of time. And notwithstanding Disney's rewrite of history, he did not fall in love with Pocahontas. However, Pocahontas was in fact present there. She was considerably younger than John Smith, and actually she did marry one of the settlers there in Jamestown, whose name was John Rolfe, R-O-L-F-E. That was in 1617. She died about 8 years later, so it was not a long marriage, but she was very helpful and really did form a rather instrumental role in that colony at that time. Jamestown was not profitable. In fact, it suffered devastating losses for about 20 years. They really couldn't find a good, profit-making crop or product. There wasn't any gold there, such as the Spanish had found in other areas of the Americas. But finally, they did come across what actually came to be called the Jamestown gold, or the Virginia gold. It was actually a crop that went otherwise by the name tobacco. And so that was the first crop that was actually produced by these folks that made the entire venture profitable. The sophisticated English were very unhappy to learn that Jamestown was actually making a profit by the selling of tobacco. And I think they actually had the Surgeon General warning way back then, you see, about the use of that stuff. But nevertheless, it did, of course, meet I'll use the term very loosely, need in the world of that day. And so the tobacco crop actually became very important. And it was in that connection that the original import early on of the use of slave labor to accomplish the work in the tobacco harvest actually took place. As I say, the life of the church in Jamestown was very consistent with the Church of England. There was not any strong impulse to jump ship. This was all really pretty much staying within the confines of James' mandate and so on. There were ministers that came to the New World who served in Jamestown in the Anglican Church, but generally speaking, the quality of their ministry was not good. This was not considered a career destination to come to the New World. It wasn't a move up, generally, for the clergy to cross the ocean over to this kind of unsophisticated and uncivilized area in America. And so generally, the people that came to perform the priestly roles in Jamestown were not those who really rose to the top of the society as great leaders and visionaries, which was very unlike the Puritan movement that came later, where some of the finest, brightest, and best indeed were those who came to participate in this New World venture. Probably of greater interest to us for our immediate concern is another movement that occurred about the same time but took a somewhat different course. In 1607, not only did the London Company send this venture over to the New World, but at the same time, there was, of course, in England this kind of upheaval religiously. We've talked about the fact that all three kinds of church life were represented at that time. You had the Anglican Church, which was essentially Episcopal, looked a whole lot like the Catholic Church, top-down authority, of course, operating, and the highest authority in the Church of England was in the monarchy. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you had what were sometimes called the independents, or the separatists, or sometimes called the nonconformists. And this group took their name because they were not in the Church of England at all. They were objecting to it, and they wanted to establish a church outside the parameters of the Church of England. And so that group we talked about last week some, their church structure was organized more along what would be called broadly congregational lines, or in politics you would call it democracy, kind of a majority rule kind of thing, and the congregations operated in a rather autonomous sort of way. So you had that end of the spectrum. And then in the middle were those who were called the Puritans. The Puritans were distinguished because they wanted to remain within the Church of England. They wanted to be good, sons and daughters of the church, and they wanted to fix the church. So they weren't trying to leave it or destroy it. They were simply trying to improve it. And they wanted to improve it generally along Calvinistic lines or the lines of John Knox in Scotland. But that was their effort, and they were putting on considerable pressure during that time to do that. Well, under James I, the Puritans enjoyed at least a cordial relationship with the throne. James didn't really like the Puritans very much, but he was astute enough politically to know that they were a powerful bloc and that it wasn't wise to simply disenfranchise them or antagonize them, because in fact they held quite a bit of political clout. And so while he was certainly not overly sympathetic to them, he was at least willing to talk to them and negotiate with them and work with them. He was an Anglican, and he believed no bishop, no king. He needed the bishops to maintain the monarchy, but at the same time, he didn't want to simply, reject the Puritans out of hand. Not so much in the case of the nonconformists. They were much smaller in number, they had much less political power, and they were much more vulnerable, and James was much more disposed to make life for them miserable. And so that's what he did. And it actually was illegal for people to meet in these kinds of gatherings. They tended to do it out in the rural areas. They would tend to meet in these quiet little gatherings for worship, posting guards or lookouts at least to see whether, somebody representing the bishop might be coming through, and they would all be arrested and so on. And so for them, life was not nearly as pleasant or livable as it was for the Puritans. In the same year, 1607, that the London Company sent their ships over to the New World to found Jamestown, in the same year, there was a group under the leadership of a fellow by the name of William Brewster, who had several hundred who followed him, and they were part of this nonconformist community, and they decided that it was really becoming too risky to remain in England, and that they needed to go somewhere where life was a little bit more benign and accepting of them, and had more religious tolerance generally. And so they left in pretty large numbers and went to Holland. And so under William Brewster, they in 1607, same year, arrived in Holland and originally set up shop there in Amsterdam. However, they were very unhappy with life in Amsterdam. It was much too urbane. They felt that this was not a place where they wanted to rear their children and so on. And so shortly after that, under the leadership of John Robinson, they left Amsterdam and moved to Leyden, 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 Holland, which was a much smaller community and where they felt that the general culture was more accommodating to their particular approach to Christian life and thought and so on. And so there was a pretty good-sized, what we call nonconformist or independent, separatist community there in Holland. These were English people, and they were living there and maintaining themselves more or less as a separate subculture in Holland, waiting for better times. Their hope was that eventually James would soften up and kind of mollify his position somewhat. They were hoping that the Puritans might make some advances which would sort of accrue to the benefit of these outsiders, these nonconformists as well, so that at least over, within a reasonable period of time, they could return and once again become good English men and women living in merry old England. Well, in fact, it didn't happen. The general trajectory of events in England was the wrong direction. Gradually, during James' reign, the relationship with the Puritans became more tense, and certainly the relationship to the nonconformists became almost intolerable. And so while these who were in Holland were hoping for improvements, they were seeing rather a deterioration of the circumstances in England. And that was compounded by the fact that they were also seeing their little children now becoming Dutch. Now, what are you going to do with a thing like that? These are English children, and yet they're starting to talk like the Dutch. They're watching the Dutch TV programs. They're buying the Dutch toys. And so all of the things that they viewed as distinctively English and really distinctively Christian in many ways, because they had tied those two together, at least at strategic points, all of those seemed to be at risk for them as they saw their own children now beginning to take on Dutch ways. And so they were caught between a rock and a hard place. Here they were in Leyden, Holland. They didn't want to stay in Holland any longer because they saw the effects of Dutch culture on them. They couldn't really return to England because life there had not improved any. What to do? And it was at that time that they actually began to entertain the somewhat outrageous idea that they might do something like what the London Company had done and actually cross the Atlantic Ocean, which itself was a fearful prospect, and try to find a safe haven, a new place in the New World where they could actually worship in the way that they wanted to as English people, in English culture, and yet English culture saturated with what they viewed as the proper and appropriate way to approach the worship of God. Well, they of course didn't have the resources or the know-how to do that on their own, so they actually sent emissaries to negotiate with representatives of the London Company. And the idea here was to see whether the London Company would actually charter a separate community under the same corporation, as it were, to establish another colonial presence in America for these who had been part of this community there in Holland. Well, this whole negotiation did proceed. It was complicated because, of course, the London Company, philosophically, was very much within the, at least religiously, within the Church of England, and these people were viewed as somewhat suspect because they were, after all, outside of the country and had a kind of strange, different religious belief. So the nonconformists had to, on the one hand, pass themselves off as good Englishmen, and yet, on the other hand, negotiate for enough autonomy and freedom that they would be able, once they got here, assuming they did, to establish religious life in this country that was not simply, down the line Anglican. And so that was very, very tricky negotiation, but in fact they were able to put that together. And in 1620, 102 people made the commitment to make the trip across the ocean. Originally there were going to be 2 ships that would be involved in this journey. However, one of them was found to be unseaworthy. The other one was marginal, but it was the one that would make the trip. It was called the Mayflower. And so 102 people piled onto the Mayflower. These were all part of this nonconformist group that had lived in Holland. Certainly not the majority of them, but the most hale and hearty of them presumably were prepared to take their wives, take their children, get on board, and head across the ocean in that little ship. And so that took place. They left in September, early September of 1620. The voyage took about 3 months. They only lost 4. Only 4 died in the journey, which was remarkable in those days. They were planning originally to land only slightly north of the existing Virginia colony. Their plan was to be more or less contiguous to Virginia, just a little north. But as it turned out, their navigational skills probably weren't quite what they had hoped for, and the weather, of course, you're somewhat at the vicissitudes of the weather anyhow, so they wound up quite a ways north. I mean, a long way north from where they had actually intended. But they were so happy to see land that as soon as they spotted it, they pointed their ship in that direction and praised God for the terra firma that was there before them, and called that place, in honor of the community that they had left in England, called it Plymouth. They had left from Plymouth, and so they called the new location where they landed Plymouth. The governor of that group was William Bradford. He was their governor for the next 30 years or so. And I'd like to read to you briefly some of his comments from his journal with respect to their experience as they landed there. He noted that they landed in late November. It was bleak, and he said, quote, "We had no friends to welcome us, no inns to entertain us, or refresh our weather-beaten bodies." He noted there were no houses awaiting for them. The wilderness was filled with both wild beasts and wild men. He asked the question, what could sustain us in the impending winter? They arrived in November. It wasn't that they had a whole lot of time to build houses and secure themselves against what was going to be a rather severe winter. He said there was nothing that could sustain them except, quote, "but the Spirit of God and His grace." He did in his journal think about what future generations might think and say about this little colony of pilgrims that would land here at Plymouth. And he made this remark, quote, his hope was that people would look back on them with this thought, quote, "Our fathers were Englishmen. which came over this great ocean and were ready to perish in this wilderness, but they cried unto the Lord, and He heard their voice and looked on their adversity. As you probably are aware, before they actually embarked from the Mayflower and set foot in the New World, they did meet and they contracted together in what was called the Mayflower Compact, which was something of a constitution, a remarkable document. There are several lectures I'd like to give that are sub-points to this lecture this morning. This is the first one. I'm just mentioning it in passing. We're going to do it someday in advanced church history. You see, we're going to come back to this, and we're going to do a little survey of the Mayflower Compact. It's quite a remarkable document, both for its religious and theological themes and also for its political themes. But as you're aware, they entered into that contract together, that constitution, and then founded Plymouth. That first winter was devastating to them. They lost about half of the men. Many of the women and children died, so it was a severe and very difficult time. By the next fall, by their first one-year anniversary, they had really had successful produce from their gardens and crops, and were able to celebrate the first Thanksgiving, in which they gave thanks to God for the providence that He had shown them in seeing them through, and that there had been at least a respectable number that had survived that event. Growth in Plymouth was slow. In fact, they landed there in 1620. Even by 1660, they had only grown to about 2,000 in number, and so this was not rapid growth there in Plymouth. They were overshadowed substantially by the Massachusetts Bay establishment, which was only slightly north of Plymouth, and it was there, of course, that we have more the Puritan infusion of life here into the New World. The Massachusetts Bay Company originated with the Puritans. Now, this was a little bit later. As I indicated to you, the Pilgrims that we've just been talking about were really moved by the harsh treatment they received under James I. But James was more cordial to the Puritans. However, the son of James, Charles I, as we were suggesting last week, was a lot more militantly hostile toward the Puritans. Many people thought Charles himself would have preferred to be a Roman Catholic. But certainly he was much more devoted, you might say, to ridding the church of this Puritan presence. And largely through his ecclesiastical henchman, Archbishop Laud, L-A-U-D, he began a rather systematic persecution of Puritans within England. Now, this was not as severe as what took place under Mary Tudor. We talked about Mary last week. She actually had people burned at the stake and that kind of thing. Thus, we remember her as Bloody Mary. Charles didn't go that far. The Archbishop didn't go that far. But the punishments that were meted out to these Puritans were pretty severe, to say the least. Floggings, imprisonments, dismemberments. There was one very famous pastor whose ears were lopped off as a punishment for being a Puritan, and that kind of thing happened. So again, this was not really a time that Puritans were finding it overly accommodating, you see, in the English life. And so once again, as interestingly happens, the persecution, the heat, as it were, in England was causing them to think about and cast a wistful eye for the possibility of going elsewhere. And so under Charles, in the early 30s, 1630s, Charles, of course, came to the throne in 1625. So by 1630, serious attempts were being contemplated to make this voyage. And it actually began around 1632, and the first real establishment in the New World under the so-called Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was the Puritan effort, took place in 1633. Again, these Puritans, at least originally, did not have any strong impulse to leave the Church of England. They weren't coming here as separatists or nonconformists. They really were still, even at this point, hoping to see the life of the Anglican Church improved. And in many ways, they were hoping to simply do it right and by example teach the folks back home how it ought to be done. They had failed, really, as they saw it, to try to change from within, but they thought if they could just come over here and do it, as it were, from scratch, that the lessons would be evident to those who were back in England, and that the adjustments might be made simply by virtue of the better example that came by virtue of the experiment, as it were, under the Puritan efforts here in the New World. Of course, the name that's generally associated with the Puritan effort there originally was John Winthrop. And his first great sermon has become legendary in the history of America, The City on a Hill. That was the idea, that this Puritan presence was going to be for the people in England and for the entire world, as it were, a beacon, a city shining, a bright and shining lamp on a hill for all the people to see. And this was really the spirit of Puritanism. It was extremely optimistic. It had a high view of the inevitability of the growth of the gospel, of the success of the growth of the church and the kingdom of God in this world. And they really did believe that they were part of what God was doing, which was opening a whole new chapter, as it were, in the growth and movement of God's work in history. To them, the word, "Thy kingdom come," was rich with meaning, and that sermon, "The City on a Hill," was really an expression of that particular idea. And if I could just at this point insert a little sub-point, I would like to at least urge and plead with you who are involved in public education, would you please fix the grotesque and outrageous caricatures of Puritanism that tend to constantly reverberate down through our educational processes, leaving impressions in people's minds that are utterly inconsistent with history. I tell you, the word puritanical, whatever it means to you, probably bears no resemblance to what the Puritans were actually all about. And if we would go back and do a little bit of honest history, we might find out that some of the greatest thinkers and the most wonderful gold mine and the greatest resource for helping us understand who we are, not only as Christians but as Americans, might come if we would give at least a passing thought to who these people really were. We have this down and dour picture of them. They love to wear bright colors. I mean, I think if we could jump in a time machine and just go back there, we'd be stunned at the cultural impact it would have. These were bright people. These were people who loved to learn. They loved to expand their thinking. They were not closed in some kind of cloistered, dark, sinister, sort of suspicious attitude about everything and everybody. These were people who built universities. They started Harvard. They founded Yale. They started Princeton. These were the people who wanted to be masters of all knowledge to the glory of God. And so, whatever we think about them, let's not labor under these delusions about who we think they were, but let's go back and give them the benefit of the doubt. I'm happy to report to you, and many of you are aware of this, that about the middle of this century, there was a great renaissance of interest in the Puritans. Not from among evangelical Christians, where you might have expected it to come, but rather among some of the finest scholars in this country, largely at Harvard and Yale. Kind of the name that's originally associated with this is a guy by the name of Perry Miller, whose name I'm sure many of you recognize. But Perry Miller was a great revisionist. I would call him a correctionist, because he was the one who went back and took another look at the Puritans and was stunned at the depth, at the amazing kind of intellectual ability and the manner in which these people elevated the whole style of society to an entirely new level that it was really theretofore unheard of. And so he really founded at Harvard, and then an echo of that at Yale, in which there's been, from that time to this, serious studies of the Puritans, not because of some kind of Christian impulse, but just simply because they're so fascinating. They were such a wonderful source of rich insight into our own heritage, and so for that reason alone, there's been a lot of interest. If you want something to read, I'll just suggest to you for openers, find Perry Miller, and the name of the book is The New England Mind. That's a good place to start. Now, there's been just voluminous writing since then, but that was kind of a seminal work in which he really kind of opened the doors in the academic world in many quarters to what the Puritans were really all about. Unfortunately, that great work has not trickled into public education. And my own recent experience with my own kids in public schools shocked me at the way in which the Puritans were still being slandered in sort of textbook history. So anyway, that's another side lecture that we're not going to do this morning, but I wanted to at least mention that. All right, by the time we get to the mid-1700s, Puritanism itself, I think it's safe to say, had lost some of its original impulse. This would be like 4 or 5 generations down the road. There was, at this point, an attempt, there had been an abiding attempt, really, to stay within the Church of England. There was a Puritan pastor, scholar, his name was John Cotton, who was really early 1700s, who was prepared finally to kind of throw in the towel, say that the Church of England was simply not going to be the means whereby the Puritan vision could be realized. And he established kind of a different, you might say, structure for the church, which has come to be called Congregationalism. It's interesting, it wasn't Presbyterianism. It could have been, probably should have been, but in a sense, as they kept beating against the Episcopal style of the Anglican Church, I think in despair, they sort of went to the other end of the spectrum and said, okay, enough of that. We're going to have a congregational approach. As you know, we Presbyterians are not congregational. We are representative government. We have a kind of a little bit of both. We have a certain authority within the church, and yet the authority ultimately is a result of the congregation recognizing leadership and choosing out leadership from among the population within the church. Well, the congregational approach went a little bit more in a direction of democratic theory of church. But in any event, at that point there was a congregational approach to the life of the church became more or less the status quo, and Congregationalism in this country really had its roots in that time from there. It was during this period of time that another amazing luminary shot across the sky of American history, whose name is Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards would be regarded as the last and greatest of the Puritan divines. Perry Miller unabashedly asserts that he is the greatest philosopher that America has ever produced. He was a man who was right up there in the class of people like Newton and Bacon and others. I mean, people who really were some of the greatest thinkers in history, and he doesn't hesitate to put him right in that class and says that no one has come since Edwards that matched his brilliance. When you start reading Edwards' philosophy, you'll believe it. But of course, Edwards was primarily a theologian and a preacher, a Puritan preacher, and it was under his ministry that a remarkable phenomenon took place during this period of time. We're now in the 1730s to 1740s, which was called the Great Awakening. This was largely under Edwards' preaching and also George Whitefield and others. And this was a time in which there was a kind of recovery of a great deal of the roots of Puritanism, certainly a recovery of what would be a very consistent Calvinism as it was presented by Edwards and others. And that really had an amazing effect. It's a remarkable story in and of itself. That's another lecture we're skipping over right now, is the story of Edwards and his life, which is in itself just an amazing side chapter that we'll be bypassing. What I'd like to do in the last couple of minutes here, in the time we have, is try to speak briefly, and 15 minutes will be much too brief, on some of the ways in which those Puritan ideas that really came ultimately from English Puritanism, and behind that from Scotland and especially from Calvin in Geneva, how those ideas worked out as a political philosophy in America. Because, as you know, the framing of the Constitution took place only, really, relatively speaking, shortly after the Puritan impulse had more or less become part of the bloodstream of our culture. You didn't have Puritanism as such anymore, but the influence of Puritanism had certainly more or less disseminated through the entire culture and was more or less taken for granted at the time that our Constitution was framed. I would certainly not go so far as to say that the Constitution itself or our whole view of jurisprudence was, just straight up Puritanism, but not far from it. And at least at certain points, I think it's interesting to see how some of these ideas played out. I'm going to run out of time long before I run out of material, but I'd like to at least give you a couple of these by way of illustration. The first one would be an idea that's called jurisdiction. The whole notion of jurisdiction. It's a principle, a legal, jurisprudential principle of constitutional governance in this country that comes straight out of Puritanism. It had been recognized historically that you've got two possible distortions in terms of styles of governance. You've got totalitarianism, where all authority is more or less vested in one person or a very small number of people. And then you've got anarchy, where in a sense everybody has whatever power they can wield. Both of those are fraught with problems. because, as the Puritans maintained rather consistently, we are corrupted people. And so, if you give people power, too much power, then their own corruption will cause the use of the power to become corrupted as well. And the Puritans took that very seriously, and that's why in England they tried to clip the wings of the king as much as they could, leading finally to the actual deposing of the king and putting in place a structure that had more of a balance of power in the parliamentary kind of approach to governance. Here, it was simply emphatic. It was doctrinal. It was, axiomatic. No sovereign. No nobility, no aristocracy, period. End of conversation. That's it. We serve no sovereigns here. That was the standard label across the bars in ancient New England. You see, if you were a sovereign, if you were a noble, don't even bother to go in. Because in this country, we don't have that kind of differentiation. What we have in terms of authority is jurisdiction. What that means is a separation of power, in which nobody has too much power, in which everybody has some little bit of it. And a separation of power, a division of labor, checks and balances, all of that really represents, at a very sophisticated level, an expression of the Puritan distrust of giving any one person too much say-so. And so they worked out in many different ways that particular principle. They found that biblically, of course, in the classical statement from Christ himself on jurisdiction. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. Render unto God that which is God. That's a jurisdictional statement. Caesar has some power. He doesn't have all power. Give him that which is appropriate to give him. Reserve from him that which he doesn't deserve to have. And give that only to God. And so the Puritans were attempting, Calvin was attempting, to work out in some sort of system of, as I say, checks and balances, a way of really giving service to that principle. Another idea that we would find in the Puritans was the notion of equality. Equality. Again, they found this notion in Calvin, and it was really unprecedented in Western history until Calvin. It had almost been taken for granted that there are among us as human beings those who are superior to others of us. Usually that superiority was a result of birth. So you were born into a noble class or into a ignoble class or a common class or something like that. It was Calvin who said, wait a minute, hold the phone. You look at the Bible, what you see is that God is no respecter of persons. You also find out that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that all have gone out of the way, that all together, you see, are corrupted by sin. And that applies equally to the king sitting in his palace and to a peasant wandering down a street. That at the one point that really matters, we are all equally corrupted before God and all equally in need of grace. And all equally can only approach God through the merits of the work of Christ. And so all of that had a great leveling effect. That what had once been kind of regarded as self-evident, that some people were superior to others, was now completely revolutionized by Calvin's, basically his doctrine of total depravity. The Puritans believed that. They took that concept to England and began to plant the seeds in England of the undoing of the great unilateral authority that vested in the king. That was part of what the Puritan revolt was all about, was to say, wait a minute. The proper place to locate power is not in some small minority because, in fact, they are as much susceptible to sin and to corruption as any of the rest of us. And so to protect ourselves from ourselves, we have to create a kind of equivalence here, not an egalitarianism as such, but a kind of protection at the point of authority and a recognition of fundamental equality among us. We brought this over, of course, in many ways in terms of our constitutional governance. We are the first nation in the history of the planet to make part of our philosophical underpinning the declaration that we think it is self-evident that all people are what? Created equal. Well, I'll tell you, for about, how many thousands of years it had not been self-evident at all. And all of a sudden we come along and say, we think it's obvious that all people are created equal. Thomas Jefferson wrote that, but I submit to you, he never would have thought of it had it not been that it was already in the air by virtue of the Puritans. It wasn't self-evident to anybody else up until the Puritans were beating the drum, you see, for that notion. And yet now we were prepared to say, it's just part of the nature of things. Well, it is part of the nature of things, but it's because it's God's nature, you see, and it's the way God has communicated His truth through His Word. We, of course, have the same idea in terms of our constitutional notion of, for example, equal protection under the law. That, if a person has a wrong that they've sustained in our system of jurisprudence, that regardless of their social station in life, that person is deserving of equal protection to any other person. Now, I realize it's not always perfectly worked out. That's because we're corrupt. But the principle was there, and it was certainly recognized and articulated well by the Puritans. The great symbol of justice in our society, Lady Justice, has a sword, has scales. The sword is pointing to the Word of God. And what's the other significant feature of the symbolism of Lady Justice? A blindfold. The blindfold is because justice wants to be blind in this sense. She doesn't want to know who's standing in front of her seeking justice. She doesn't want to know whether that person is dressed in rags or dressed in all of the trappings of nobility and wealth. She doesn't want to know, because what she wants to weigh is the justice, the equity of the situation. And that whole notion was a Puritan idea. Do you realize it was the Puritans, really Calvin, who first gave those radical ideas to Western civilization that most people thought could never work? Well, it does work, you see. And so let's tip our hats to some of their contribution at that point. Other themes I'd like to mention, but time is running out rapidly. The whole notion of fault. The fact that there is personal responsibility for the way in which we live. Be cautious in our society when we hear ideas like no fault being celebrated. You hear of no fault divorce, no fault insurance, no fault this, no fault that. Well, our system of jurisprudence was rooted in the idea that there is fault, which is to say there is responsibility. When somebody does something that is bad, that they should in fact be responsible for it before the tribunal of justice. That really was certainly refined under the Puritans. The notion of contract. In our Constitution, we have a principle of liberty of contract. That was pretty much unprecedented until the Puritans. The whole idea that we would have the freedom to enter into private contracts without the intrusion of government was a Puritan notion. And so we have them to thank for that. The principle of dominion, that is, that there is private property, that we no longer have these kind of suzerains out there, these feudal lords who own all the land, and we simply work in a kind of slavedom or serfdom for them, but that there's the right for my labor to lead to the acquisition of property is taken as part of the mandate from creation itself. That we are to, by virtue of the implementation of legitimate, good, hard labor and so on, begin to recreate, as it were, in the name of God's kingdom and in the growth of the gospel, not only the growth of His kingdom spiritually, but in many ways to reflect that physically and materially in the manner in which we conduct ourselves along those lines. So a whole theory of labor and property and the accumulation of wealth and the proper disposition of wealth all comes out of Puritanism. What we call the Puritan work ethic is just one little piece of a very broad philosophy of what it means to own property and make proper use of it within the work of God's people and so on. Notions of restitution and others. I'm simply trying to give you more or less a shotgun impression here, because I hope that through this we'll at least have some understanding of the depth of thought that these people brought to the table. And, here they were. This was the influence that was really in the air when we were trying to, as it were, create a new country. Create a new body politic that would be called the United States. I mentioned before that some historians have called John Calvin basically the inventor of the United States. It's true. A great deal of what we take for granted as political theory can be traced back principally to the political implications of his theology. And of course in Scotland, in England, and most of all in America, there was a very consistent effort to try to implement that in a credible kind of way.